Director of the Charles River Watershed Association. The staff people who may be helpful aren't in the room at the moment, but DPW Director Chris Stoddard will be here shortly, and Rebecca Mangata, who's also from Westland Sampson, will be in here. What we'd like to do is what we promised last fall, and that's to revisit the process we went through in determining the most suitable site to host the quirk, which is basically the treatment facility associated with the sewer, and it has a fancy name because it's got all sorts of new technologies involved with it, but other than that, it can pretty much be thought of as a sewer treatment plant in a historic sense. We went through this process over a year ago, first go around, and then after the questions that were raised at town meeting, a number of concerns from residents, neighbors on New Estate Road in the area, we promised to go back and revisit it again. Good, you did some maps, Rebecca. And the engineers have done that, and we've gone through that again with them. We threw new properties at them to entertain, and we promised that there'd be a chance for you folks to do the same, and that's what we're doing tonight. So Kent and Corey have a PowerPoint, but I've asked them to be prepared to interrupt at any point somebody has a question. We also have maps too, and I think to be most successful, I would imagine that we would like to encourage this meeting to be as interactive as we can. So if you are more comfortable standing up here, looking at the maps, pointing at them, and raising questions as we go along, feel free to do that. It's hopefully be less structured than some of the other meetings. If you don't understand something or dispute a point being made during the presentation, as long as it's respectful, just speak up. We're going to try to get there. What we'd like to do is have everybody at least understand the thought process that went through and the criteria that we used in determining the ranking of various properties and why they came out as they did. And who knows, you may well have a better idea about the conclusions that we've reached at this point. And with that, I guess I'll turn it over to, well, first, Chase, do you have any other opening remarks you'd like to add there too?
I think you pretty much covered that.
Okay, thank you. Then with that, again, thank you all for coming. And Kent from Weston & Sampson, or I'm blanking your last name all of a sudden. Yeah, right. Somehow I go to the name of an old Red Sox relief pitcher, Kent Burke.
There you go. Confused all the time.
Yeah, right. It's that time of year, spring training. Anyway, Kent, you want to start us off?
So what we're going to do is kind of go through very quickly a bunch of information that we have assembled as far as the site screening that was done, some of the information that's important to us about the way those sites were evaluated, and then we're going to talk about some of the sites we got narrowed down to and some of the sites that we find that aren't quite as optimal, and then we kind of left a lot of time for questions at the end. So we're going to try to be pretty quick with this, but as Paul said, absolutely, if you're missing something or you want to slow down on a point, grab us, stop us, and we'll go from there. So really quickly, the initial site evaluation that we did for the project, we started with a geographic information system screen of the entire set of parcels for the town. Obviously, there's a lot of parcels in the town, and it's not appropriate to look at every single one of them. For instance, ruling out small parcels, parcels that have homes on them, parcels that are completely developed, parcels that have wetlands or have other conservation issues. We basically took that screening and we used a number of sieves to kind of pass them through and very quickly narrow down every parcel in the town to a number of 66 parcels. So those 66 really were parcels that were both big enough to be able to host what we need for the quirk site. They were sufficiently devoid of some type of protective thing such as wetlands, agriculture, that we didn't have to deal with that. And we then said that doesn't necessarily make them optimal parcels. What does make them optimal parcels is other things like availability for trucking, limited receptors, and so we actually used a bunch of these parcels to screen for a number of factors, and we came down to 13 final sites. Those 13 final sites were presented about a year and a half ago to the selectmen for the first time, and we've talked about them in a number of subsequent meetings. But as you can see from this map, those original 66 that you see surrounded in red and blue here, spread all over the town, very broadly spread. One of the criteria that we have is a financial criteria that we use for proximity to the service area. So most of you know that the service area basically is centered around where 495 and 119 cross by the common. And so the sites in that area were our first choice. Secondary were sites nearer to our discharge sites, which ended up being down along Route 2A. And then every site that kind of lies outward in the town was a little less desirable. So this figure I can tell you is, I know, a little hard to read, but you get the sense of where the town is. That's also a matrix of all of the sites in the upper right-hand corner. And we presented this information before. This information is available if people are interested in it.
Is it on the website now?
Yeah, it was on the website, so yeah, it's in a few of the past presentations, so it should still be there. In the end, that led us to the decision early on that one site bubbled to the top, which was the site of the Highway Department, which is the LELWD Littleton Highway site at 39 Air Road. It was identified as the preferred site. It wasn't the only site, but it was identified as the preferred site for a number of reasons, which were non-financial and financial and logistic reasons, amongst others. One of the things we particularly liked about that site was the fact that there was already some trucking going to and from that site, and that we wouldn't, with the number of vehicles we expect to take to travel to and from the quirk, we wouldn't actually see an appreciable change in the level of trucking that would go to and from the site over the course of the day when the quirk was built. Obviously, there's some concerns with that, and there's always a need to do some good due diligence, so we then went back and revisited the screening for a couple of reasons, not the least of which was the Board of Selectmen at town meeting had voted that we try very hard to look for some more appropriate sites. So since last late October, when we had that discussion, we've been talking to folks, trying to find some additional sites. The board members themselves threw out some sites. Some of the staff put together some sites that we should look at. And we tried to look a little bit harder at what might be available other than the sites that we had already screened. And one of the things we came back with was the need to also look at the criteria we had used. And one of the criteria that we weighted more highly at this point in time was proximity to residential homes. And again, specifically in response to concerns from some of the neighbors.
Can I ask a question on that particular criteria?
Yep.
We looked over the report, and what I see is the proximity to the closest resident, and I noticed that that was singular.
Yep.
So what I'm curious about is, in particular, when you look at the site that you've chosen, the New Estate Road, it's a very densely populated area, as opposed to, say, the gravel pit, where, number one, I'm not sure how we only have a single number of distance to a resident when it's a 192-acre parcel. But also I want to know how much is weighted into how many residents will be affected. Because if we're just looking for one apartment building with one person living in it as opposed to a very dense neighborhood like our own, I see those as two different weighting systems, and considerably different, to be quite honest, when you look at the impact of public health. So I want to make sure that that was taken into consideration, not just looking for one resident, putting a pin in and saying this is the closest, and also looking at a sizable parcel like, like the gravel pit, and making sure that your proximity takes into account really the furthest distance. If you were to choose, for example, probably the closest parcel to 2A is far different from a residential area than, say, the back corner where you start bumping up against speculative ponds.
So I can answer a couple of those things right off, and I can tell you that it's a very, very valid point that you think about how many total people are exposed to this, but there's also some validity to the fact that we're not going to pick one residence and say, hey, because you're the only one here, we're going to stick a facility next to you. And I think the distance to the nearest receptor is a reasonably good measure of that. What we did with the gravel pit site is we actually picked a site that was far enough back that it would easily be the more distant from any of the properties that we would have from residential receptors. If you look at the numbers we did, that's one of the reasons we really like that site, is it bubbles up to the top because of the more distant. The challenge is the further back on that site that we push it, we could get that distance to be even more than the, Rebecca, I'm thinking it was like 1,000, 1,100 feet or something like that. That could go further to, we got to a point where I think we said we could maybe get to 1,500 feet from a residence. The challenge is that additional distance we then also have to cover with multiple pipes. And that changes our financial criteria as well, so as you see further on, the kind of more remote we make this, the more challenging the cost aspect becomes. There's a little bit of a balance to be had there.
I certainly understand that, I mean, but when you're looking at it, and please correct me if I'm reading the report incorrectly, the cost is going to be incurred mostly by the folks that are actually using the system. So to be quite honest, they're getting the benefit for it, they should pay for it. And if you look at a system like Groton, for example, the way that they're tied into their sewer system, the cost that you would incur if you were to go up to the gravel pit would be very similar to the cost that they're incurring in Groton, and that their businesses and additional residents are paying those prices. I know for certain because I was one of them. You know, it is not an unreasonable ask to go up to from 10 to 14 to basically take into account the public health aspect of it. And to be quite honest, given that this is an optional tie-in service that the businesses benefit from, you know, that's something that they should be prepared to incur. So I don't see that as something that's unreasonable, and especially when you look at the total cost of the project being in the $28 million range. I mean, going up $1.3 million, let's just be quite honest, that's a bit of a rounding error. I mean, I know it's a big number when you say it in separate, but, you know, when you're already looking at budgets of $29 million, that's something that realistically I think we should expect people to be able to incur that cost of an extra, you know, $4. I don't think that's unreasonable. So I think the more remote you can get it, the more you take in public health. I mean, that has to outweigh a couple dollars here or there to a business that's benefiting from this site and expected to be able to grow their business because they're using this site. So essentially, it's cutting into profit that they're gaining from the project. It's not a cost out of their pocket. Sorry, I talked a lot.
No, there's no reason to interrupt. It was all very valuable. I will say, at some points on certain properties, it's going to be difficult for us to give a full answer whether or not we've had conversations with the owners. Some of that is confidential until they want it to be otherwise. But in some cases with properties, the vetting process that Kent just spoke to was exhaustive, but it included properties where the owners just were not interested in selling for whatever reason. So that
And we cover that as well, especially the IBM property, for example. And I don't know when that conversation happened, but I'm not sure how much people are aware. IBM sold the Lotus business off to HCL, I believe roughly 6 months ago, bringing down the occupancy of that building by probably, you know, if my count's correct, about 40%. So I'm not sure if their decision-making process has changed since the occupancy of that building, and honestly, the long-term viability of IBM being there may have changed as well.
Well, that's good information, although not everyone is aware in town, and we discovered in the context of this process, IBM does not own that property. A whole property holding company, Hudson Properties owns it, they're based in Texas.
Yep.
And their interest in IBM's, you would hope, would coincide, but they don't always, and in any event, while we have a decent dialogue, the town, I should say, is a decent dialogue with the IBM folks, they don't make that decision. It's the people at Hudson Properties, and we have had contact with them, not very fruitful contact. They have a whole different agenda.
Understood. My feeling is, though, that when you look at an office property and you look at the occupancy being so low because of the change in your tenant, that's actually more concerning as a property owner, that you may not have a lot, let's face it, property, you know, companies coming into Littleton, that this is not exactly the technology hub. I mean, we're lucky IBM chose the spot. So looking at someone to re-up that building, they could have land that's not overly usable. So there just may be additional anxiety there that we could leverage to gain a parcel of that.
Okay, for the record, we have had numerous contacts with the people who own the property, but if there's been new developments, we have no problem committing, I would say, Chase, to going back again with new information to approach the old owners.
Thank you.
Just, can I just add to that? IBM did just buy Red Hat, and they're probably pulling everybody out of Westford.
I heard it might be the opposite because they just redid the Westford building.
So you heard the other way?
That's, the rumors go depending on whether you're talking to the Red Hat people or the IBM people.
So it could be an empty building.
Yeah, they just renovated the place across.
But that, you know, we think it's a wonderful spot. Problem is, the owners may think the last thing they want to do while selling it is get involved in a complicated suing process. But anyway, we can revisit that dialogue, but we have had dialogue with them before.
Sorry, if I can interject with respect to IBM. One of the one of the central tenets that we've approached this project with is that we're not going to cut a special deal to IBM as a user, essentially funding the sewer on the backs of the smaller businesses in town so that IBM can get a cheaper rate so that it's more favorable
Right,
for
but not
them.
legal, we can't do that.
Well, we can't do that, and we're not interested in exploring ways to make it passively legal. You know, one thing, though, that we have contemplated and considered, though, is some reasonable compensation for acquiring a piece of property. You know, it's one thing if they're a user, it's a different thing if the facility is located on their property. And so, you know, we're willing to engage them in that regard. You know, how much would it take to site the facility here? Because we recognize that there's a cost associated with it. Even with that, it's essentially been crickets from Hudson Properties.
So, associated with IBM, we recently learned that the planning board, in response to the water department having to draw down the Beaver Brook well more, our zone 2 aquifer protection is extending into the common, and it includes IBM's property. And so I'm wondering if that's an onus to say to them, hey, listen, septage may start to become problematic for a large building. You know, would you reconsider?
They, yeah, we're very aware of that too, and we have been
Yeah,
working with
pretty
our
aware.
partners in the water department of this process.
Are they aware of it, though? I mean, if they're in Texas, I would imagine
Oh,
they
yeah,
don't know
well,
what.
they're
this
very well
means.
aware because the DEP, they're already in a, what's the correct term? Ken,
Enforcement?
with a- Well, no, with,
The wastewater treatment facility.
on their treatment facility, they're in discussions with DEP because they're having problems with it already, with the existing facility. So you'd think that all the motivation in the world would be there to deal with this, but so far that hasn't been the response.
And furthermore, because they, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kensington Court, it's one thing to compel commercial property owners to connect. We've actually changed the trajectory of the system a little bit. Residences will still have the choice to opt in and opt out, but commercial property owners won't have that choice. However, those entities with their own wastewater treatment plants, we essentially can't compel to connect. So that means that the Point and IBM, short of incurring a lot of legal fees and still probably losing, we can't force them to join, whereas other commercial properties with septic systems, we can.
Although, then again, there's a study in contrast, even though they're both free to be as independent as they want, IBM is, the owners of that IBM property are being completely disinterested in dealing with this, while Sam Park at the Point is trying very hard to find a way to, to blend his existing system in with ours, so that's a hopeful thing. It doesn't really address this problem, though. Gary?
So, a couple of years back, when I was active on the board, we talked about the sewer, they came in front of us,
Planning board to be.
planning board, and the proposal at that time was to use existing plant structure. So the Point, I know he left a hook up there for us, we were gonna use Moran's plant, we were gonna potentially use the high school's plant. These are all plants that are operating way in the capacity. Now it sounds like the proposal is moved to go to a centralized plant farther off-site, downstream from the high school, that you're gonna feed. So you're not even distributing the water, return water equitably up there. You're now gonna pump it all the way down and then pump it into that aquifer system. So I don't understand, why did it move away from that? I mean, are there generators, and from what I just heard from Mr. Chase, indicated that anyone with an existing plant doesn't have to hook in. So who is gonna generate to make this plant viable? If all your major generators aren't even hooking in.
Right, bunch of questions in there. First of all, I don't know what you're referring to in terms of using existing systems, because that's never been a part of the program as far as I've been involved in. In the one instance that I can speak to, the properties you listed, God bless you. The Point, they're very, very close to capacity, and one of the points we were interested in is using any excess capacity they would have, and it's really not there to be had. But as far as putting water to the aquifer, that's kind of precisely the point of using the town's existing sewer discharge, is to get the water back closer to the aquifer where it came from. It's water currently now is pumped more from the that side of town and brought to the common area and then dumped into septic systems. Bringing it back is essentially bringing it back where it come from. I thought that was a wonderful story. The water department tells me it's really, not that significant one way or the other, but
So it's better for the aquifer?
that was my pitch, but I gotta be honest, the water department says it's a great line, but it doesn't really make a heck of a lot of difference one way or the other, so I'll accept their wisdom on that point.
But the major generators, they don't have to hook in.
There's only two that applies to that I can think of, right? I don't know if there are any others.
Well, IBM has a plant, Moran has a plant. and the
Well,
Point has a plant.
I'm not so sure what the status is of Moran's in relation to this, but IBM and the Point are big enough at least that they trigger that. We'll certainly look into the others. Any other questions at this point, Bob?
On recharging the aquifer, from a water department's point of view, recharging the aquifer may or may not have significance because of where they pump for their wells. But for the aquifer, it has significance for surface water bodies. In this instance, particularly Beaver Brook. And the other thing I'd add is that IBM is also at capacity. I think their total capacity is 35,000 gallons a day, and they're around 30,000 gallons a day.
And we're also gonna have other towns shipping their stuff in as well?
No.
No?
Are you talking about wastewater, or are you talking about the anaerobic
Waste,
digester?
actual waste.
Just, all that's been discussed has been restaurant food waste. Do you want, Chase, do you want to speak to that?
I think
Septic
you're,
trucks?
in terms of septage, the answer is no. In terms of food waste for the anaerobic digester, the answer is yes.
Okay,
Does that?
okay. I understood
No, we're not entertaining
septic
any.
waste.
No, it's the catchment area for the properties in Littleton that it would even come from is now fairly well defined. We adopted the map for it. It's essentially the common area, and that's about it. And most of it is commercial properties. You know offhand what the percentage is on that?
Well, property count, it's about 100 commercial properties and about 175 residential.
Yeah, but in terms of potential volume,
It's about 50, it's
Is
close,
it?
a lot closer to
Okay.
50/50.
All right.
And of course, remember, though, the town has a good share of that,
Right.
which is
existing
neither
town
commercial
facilities, this building, and
nor
some of the others.
residential, so, yeah, between
Yeah.
the schools.
But in terms of, what's being processed in the
Yeah.
plant, is never a bad time to reinforce what's being proposed, and that's just septic relief for that part of town, treated at a plant which will ultimately discharge at a site that we're already using for the town's existing sewer system, the sewer system that treats this building and goes down pipes right down King Street currently. And the only outside product that's been talked about, and this is to take full advantage of the quirk technology, is to bring in a limited amount. I think I remember it would put to truckloads, something in the neighborhood of about 6 truckloads a week or so to help feed the...
A week, yeah.
Yeah, 6 truckloads a week of food waste from restaurants or supermarkets to feed the anaerobic digester to produce more energy, which helps on the making this project self-sufficient.
Did you say we're up to 6 truckloads a week?
I think that's
I thought we
not
were-
up to it. I don't think it's really changed in...
Same number.
I thought it was 1, maybe 2.
That was a day number when that.
So
Yeah,
just-
that's a day number.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So just to, we were told that FIBA wasn't gonna be an issue, we wouldn't even notice that they were there. We had to call Roland, we had to call the owner, we had to meet with a ton of people, just to bring the noise compliance level just to the normal level. And the smells that come out from there, it's ridiculous. During the summer, there was a generator that ran down at the highway department. We knew nothing about the fact that it was coming there until we called about it. The smell was like burning, yeah, it was horrible. We had to call the police department to find out what was going on because it was after hours. The next day, we received a notice on our doors that said it would run about 10 hours per week. It was more like 10 hours a day.
I'm sorry, what are you talking, what's running?
The generator, a generator.
For what, though?
It was to bring down
Peak hours.
Peak
off
hours.
the
the peak hours, yep.
This has nothing to do with it.
No, but,
It's just
yeah.
a cumulative.
So can you guarantee to us that the trucking in and out isn't gonna, increase the noise level over there, and there's not gonna be a smell or an odor that's gonna come up
Yeah.
into our houses? Because it's bad enough with FIBA and the generator, and there's some backup noise that we hear, and a
That's
slamming.
the salt truck backing up and dumping.
Yeah, that's even over the summer.
It's, yeah,
Okay,
Which wakes us up at night while we.
I live up there, I get the buses coming in at 5:30 in the morning, they wake me up in the bedroom with their headlights, but I think that's, that's a good problem to have, I guess. As far as the generator, that's the first I've ever heard of that, so I don't know, Chris, I don't want to put you on the spot here.
That was the light department.
Light department? Okay, I'm not sure it's telling
Nick
you.
used them as off.
But I would ask, first, two things. I know we have both Bob Zimmerman and Chris, you've been involved with operating sewer treatment plant before. Do you want to speak at all to some of the concerns, folks who, we haven't had it before? Well, actually, we have had it in town, but it's so minimal that people don't even notice it. But if you want to speak to what they can expect in terms of noise and smell.
Yeah, I can, well, as far as this one goes, the whole plan is to have this entire sewer treatment plant inside, housed in the building. Obviously, some of them, they have outdoor tanks and stuff like that. The intention is to have it completely indoors. Even the dumping sites for the trucks to be inside. As far as the truck traffic, last week, I got 26 truckloads of salt. I don't know how many of those trucks you saw or heard come in and out. But I got 26 of them in 1 week. We're talking 6. So it really isn't going to be a huge impact as far as trucking goes.
And Chris, those 26, that's 18 wheelers.
Correct. Right. Yeah, those are 26, 18. The trucking, I don't think is going to be a huge issue. Like I said, the trucks, the way we theoretically designed the building to pull in and pull out, so there should be no backing. And we're pulling into a building, and all of it's going to be dumped inside the building. Correct, all negative air pressure. So theoretically, none of the smell should go naturally out. It should all go through filtering systems. Yeah, I mean, one of the big things is the high school has a plant. Not necessarily similar to this, but.
Yeah, I don't know if everyone's aware of that
If
or
you go to the
not.
high school, I've never.
We have an existing treatment plant right there next to what's it, down by the tennis courts?
Yes, right into the tennis
If you haven't noticed it, then that's what we're talking about, is that on a bigger scale.
And if you have noticed it, what you probably have noticed is the noise rather than the smell. And what's important to note is that that system at the high school essentially has no meaningful noise dampening anything.
Regarding the filtering, so for an anaerobic digester, and even if it's enclosed, yes, you have to filter out because you produce as an off-gassing system, you're going to have hydrogen sulfide, which produces that sulfur smell. You're going to have methane. Those have to be vented out. And even with carbon-based filtering, you cannot 100% guarantee that's going to be filtered out, let alone even some of the specialized microbial filtrations, they can't guarantee that these are going to be filtered. We are in a highly dense population of a lot of children who will be very at risk for, there's been studies that have shown, even with these enclosed systems, that these type of aerosols or pathogenic bacteria, basically disease-causing type things, can cause gastrointestinal distress. You can also have people who have already respiratory issues like asthma because of these factors have these issues. Our concern is as Mike brought up earlier, this is a very dense region. We have a large population of young children who are susceptible. Our doctors have already told us if this goes in, we need to move. Because one, we have immunocompromised individual, 2 people with asthma, and we cannot take that risk. And the town should, as a whole, have a responsibility to public health. As Michael said, we're already putting in close to 30 million. I think honestly, if the town's gonna have to start covering possible health issues, then property loss, that's well over $1 million. I mean, this should really be taking all this into account, because carbon-based filtering is not gonna take care of 100% of everything.
I'm sorry, are you talking about the highway site?
The highway site behind the estate, yes.
Okay.
We have a
If
lot
it was
of children.
located there, your neighborhood?
Pretty highly affected. We've already been advised to move when this goes in. So, and no resident should be present.
Mr. Zimmerman can speak maybe to the technology a little bit.
Yeah, there's very little off-gassing with this particular anaerobic digester because the gases created by the bugs are going to be used to drive a turbine. They're going to be burnt. This is a pretty dramatic reduction in methane and CO2 emissions from the waste. The other thing I'd point out is that Littleton has had a similar sized anaerobic digester operating in town for 25 years. I used to live about 800 feet from it. It's at what was Very Fine, operated by Pepsi. We never had any odor issues. They off-gas, they do off-gas.
All summer.
No, well, that's because the guys that owned it previously didn't shut it down well. And when they brought it back up, there were problems. Are there problems now?
That's not the point.
It's,
You just said there was never any problem, and then you just
Well,
said,
for
well,
20
it was a problem, but it's, and that's the thing that we're concerned
What I'm
about.
trying to say is that when Kraft left, they didn't appropriately shut down the facility. And so when Pepsi tried to bring it back up, there were problems, and I admit that, but it's operating for 25 years with the exception of that moment in time, appropriately and without any impact on the surrounding neighbors. I am one of them. I live there.
Since September as well.
Yeah.
Once they.
So, yes, Pepsi did struggle because of the way it had been shut down. Kraft left and kicked the can down the road. Maybe, we should talk to Kraft about that. This is a different kind of facility. And the entire thing will be enclosed, and as Chris said, negative air pressure, so that even if there are leaks in the building, nothing escapes. It goes the other way. It comes back in.
Okay, gentleman back here?
Somebody mentioned the septic tank at the high school and having like no smell at all. But speaking as a high schooler, high school senior who's been here 4 years, it has occurred a few times where the septic tank has leaked and like you can smell it in the whole school. Like it's been there for like 3 or 4 days at least when you can clear it all out. And as a tennis player, playing on those courts next to the septic tank, there's always like a lingering smell there. Not like a really strong smell, but there's always some kind of smell there. So.
I have a different question, but I live directly behind the high school. I live about 1,200 feet from the building. I had to call the Department of Health 3 times in November because it was malfunctioning. It was right before the snow. I wanted to be outside. I could not physically be outside in my yard. It was really bad, and it was hours, and it was due to a malfunctioning part. I think we know that the high school system. So it is an impact, and perhaps when these systems or not perhaps, I know I've done wastewater permitting at industrial facilities. I did it for 8 years. I'm familiar with different wastewater processes. When they're working well, no, it shouldn't necessarily be a nuisance beyond noise. My concern is when it's not operating properly or down for maintenance, is there going to be like a flare or a boiler, for example, to burn off? Because anaerobic digestion is a finicky process, and this is something I've gotten directly from the Mass DEP wastewater folks in my process of industrial permitting. Anaerobic digestion is finicky. We're going to need, at a minimum, full-time personnel to operate this facility. And so, are there case studies that you have that these have operated so close to homes? Because what I've seen is industrial facilities, and again, in my experience doing compliance and permitting at industrial facilities, it's like, did a tree fall, if the tree falls in the woods, did it make a sound? Nobody heard it, and that's usually why these things are cited elsewhere. And so I'm wondering, what case studies did you look at to assess that it's okay to put it so close to people's homes, and furthermore, close to people's homes that if you had a stack or a flare or some sort of emission other than your hydrogen sulfide, everything is going up and these homes are above. So this is where these emissions are going. And so can you speak to how you arose at the decision that this is safe, and what case studies, what other facilities in the state can you point to that are anaerobic and combined heat and power generation Because my understanding is Very Fine has aerobic digestion as well. It's a different system.
Yeah, you want to speak to that?
Sure.
Actually, can we have a picture of this, because I'm having trouble picturing where this site is and where the residences are around it, because I have not
Go back to
seen
the
it.
map and then, I don't know if we can, can you zoom in there?
I'll try to get your, yeah.
Why don't you try to zoom
I
in?
have to break out the slideshow to do that, but that might be a good idea.
That's all right.
It's all gonna fit on that picnic table.
You can go somewhere else.
So,
So, in context, this big yellow parcel is the gravel pit. This is the high school in bright green. You can see New Estate Road comes up and around. This is A Road to King Street 2A. The site we're talking about right now is this is the highway building. This is the LELWD building behind it. So the site we're talking about is just behind the highway building here. In
Yeah, so
context.
if you look down the
Tre-
hill from our
treatment-
house, you can see it.
Treatment would occur here. If you're familiar with the site, behind this, there's, right behind this, there's a couple of barns where Chris stores salt, the two big salt sheds. And then behind that, there's kind of a big open area where there's wood chippings and other things on the site. The back edge of that area is spoiled, there's a big soil pile. The back edge of that is the tree line that is on the slope that goes up to New Estate Road with the houses up above. So basically that.
But on the side, it would
There's a
be
pretty
behind
good,
the
pretty good
highway.
slope line right here. These couple little gray things near my cursor right here that are in the white are actually the highway barns that are, where the salt is stored.
And the
And then the slope is
treatment
down.
plant would be in front of the highway.
Yeah, the
barns.
treatment plant would
Well,
be
the
down
barns would be
on-
between New Estate Road.
On the yellow parcel, yeah, right.
And 650 feet, is that correct to the closest?
And the
houses right
650
next?
is measured from where we expect right now the back of this would be the nearest residence up there. There's a few residences.
Yes, our houses.
So if you were standing in the back of any of our yards, you'd be able to look straight down and see it.
If you can see the curb lines.
I can see it from the back of my,
You
I
can
walk
see-
to the back of the gate and I look straight down and I can see everything.
Yeah, if you can see the salt sheds, you would likely be able to see the building.
Yeah.
And so, in the event that it's not working at 100%, good scenario.
So, but back to your question, absolutely, these are, it's a little bit different technology. A lot of facilities used to be built with anaerobic digestions. They were built in all sorts of places, including in residential areas. Not everybody kept running them. They actually have a lot of problems. And the reason they have a lot of problems isn't so much the generation of the gas, it was the ability to use the gas, and that's why a lot of facilities actually abandoned using anaerobic digestion. One of the big issues is there's so many things in wastewater when you digest it, even the gas ends up becoming tricky to burn, and it affects the equipment when you try to burn it. So the processing cost to kind of scrub the gas out.
Siloxanes and.
Yeah, siloxanes and things like that.
Yep.
Processing costs to scrub those out made it a little less cost effective, especially with the technology we used at the time to do that. So a lot of facilities that had digesters that were at, treatment plants in the middle of residential communities actually abandoned the process in Massachusetts. Facilities in other parts of the country, and particularly other parts of New England, didn't abandon the process and still do it regularly. For example, Maine and Vermont, more rural areas tend to have a lot of these. And they do have them in proximity to residential neighborhoods where they run them. They run them, they've been running them for many, many years.
Do you know how
It's the
close?
distance
It's more
between
about,
the places in our area of the septic.
there's not a
treatment.
lot of your point
Well-
is a valid one. There's not a lot of examples of this particular type of facility in Massachusetts in this close proximity. for a number of reasons, one of which is, this is one of the things that makes this an unusual project. The concept of trying to do the smart sewers is
But
to
other
re-
towns have
is
sewers,
to
so how about treatment plants, period? What's the,
There's quite a few small treatment plants that are in closer proximity to, some of the closer ones here are, if anyone knows where the South Acton plant is.
Yeah.
In the south side of Acton, there's a plant, I think it's 180 feet from the corner of the plant building to the nearest home. The Concord wastewater treatment plant is within, one of their open tanks, it's within a couple hundred, I think it's 250 feet of one of the residential buildings on the main
It's the
lot.
same technology,
No.
Different, but those are
It's
open,
different
those are
technology.
uncovered tanks and different.
but they're aerobic. It's aerobic, right?
Um,
Not anaerobic?
Well,
So
most
they-
plants have a combination.
Sure.
So open tankage, we tend to do aerobic because you
Right.
have to do that.
So
You can't do
aerobic will smell very differently from an anaerobic.
Which is why,
process.
back to your original point, which is why we do things like, there are fail-safes at the plant. We can't, we wouldn't do
So
the
like
gas without,
flares
we
or-
wouldn't do the gas without a flare
There,
first.
so you'll have a flare.
We would have the flare for emergency purposes, but our actual proposal is not to, at this point in time, we don't anticipate running the flare much, because you also mentioned the cogen process that we talked about. The way to do that efficiently is we can actually bring in natural gas and blend it and burn it, so that we can actually, even if we're generating a small enough amount of gas, we can still burn it and make something out of it. The reason that most facilities flare off is because they generate enough gas to have to not be able to store it. It has to go somewhere,
Right.
but not enough gas to cost effectively burn it. And so there's some plus
So what
minus to the
emissions
technical
would
issues.
result from the flaring and the, from a public health and safety standpoint, air emissions, I feel is a big concern. Have you done like a permitting analysis? Do you know
So-
your potential to
So the
emit?
permitting is yet to be done.
Do you know your
It will-
potential to emit at
it
all,
will
or?
be- Yeah, it's essentially, right now, our best guess is this is on the order of a 250 kW genset, which would be the same as if we fueled that with natural gas and burned it in the area. It's likely to not get any significantly bigger than that. It's possible that it might be a bit smaller. Our actual initial intent is to use more of that gas for heat purposes if we can. Use it in a boiler instead of in a genset. And if we do it in a boiler, we can actually take advantage of heat off of it, and it burns more efficiently, and we can actually make use of a lot of that on site. And that's one of the other factors that is in our presentation is,
One thing, I just want to test the audience, see if the interest is, and Kent was particularly, Kent and Corey, prepared to go through a variety of parcels that rank lower, if you were interested in going through any of those to see whether or not you could see the thought process that went through, why they were ranked out. If that's of interest, we could go through a couple of those. I see Selectman Coast is asking.
Just a quick comment. There are more of these than we necessarily realize around us. Like, I bet you a lot of people didn't think that IBM had one on their side of the point, and maybe people would know there was one at the high school. But at Magog Park, there's one which is very close proximity to a lot of residences. Avalon and back of Magog Park has their own facility. And when 15 Great Road was built, there was one in a residential development that services 3 apartment buildings and the 70 homes that were developed there. So they're not the same systems, so I'm not going to speak to that, but there are a number of these facilities kind of among us.
Yeah, but the fact is, though, you have a viable site, much further proximity to residents at your disposal that we're getting rid of because of cost.
I'm not going to address that,
Yeah.
just making a point of clarification.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm just pointing out that what we're discussing is maybe sort of probably, there is no certainty in a science like this, and what you have is the ability to go 3, maybe 4x further from any resident for the cost of a simple increment of the sewage cost, for which people haven't even been paying for to date, so it's not like you're asking them to incur more costs.
I'll say this much, and I thought that was a great point when you made it earlier, that at least in the case of the second and third choices, which have pluses, although we're not even sure we, are able to buy them, but I commit personally, and I'm sure the group would not object to revisiting those again establishing contact with those people again, go down that road. The money factor is not the be-all and end-all, but it does affect the viability of the overall project. So it's not a non-consideration, but, I hear you loud and clear. As far as the level of properties or the number of properties that rank just somewhat below those top three, it might not be a bad exercise to look at a few of those because they eliminate themselves from serious consideration for their own reasons, but maybe Kent can speak to that. But I want to make a commitment to you that, I would say we can certainly go back on those two properties.
Site number 2 is fine, I don't necessarily think we.
Yeah, well, they may not want to sell it.
But one thing to point out there, though, is that the argument that if we put it in the center of the gravel pit, we could maximize the distance is not wrong, except for the fact that that would completely eliminate any use of the gravel pit. So what we did is we chose a location in the gravel pit without any input whatsoever from the property owners, where we would ideally like to locate this, to maximize the distance that we thought was most likely to be agreeable to the owners of the gravel pit. That's not in the center of the gravel pit, right? That's on one edge. That would also keep the other interests to a minimum, such as things like trucking, right? If you put it all the way to the northwest side of the gravel pit, you have a whole bunch of additional trucking and the disturbance associated with that. So we've tried to balance those things even within these scenarios.
But we can definitely go back on those two fronts. So let's let Kent, since he queued it up anyways, might as well speak to a few of the other properties.
One of the parts of the last discussion we had, though, was the discussion of how we use the heat from the digester, which is our preference. And right now, what we really like about the DPW and LELWD site is that there are a couple of big buildings right next to that are actually right now heated with electric unit heaters. If anyone knows how we do things, the least efficient way you can heat a large space is electric unit heaters. It's actually really wasteful from a cost efficiency standpoint, and it doesn't do anything for anybody except burn a lot of electricity. It's relatively cost effective to put in because it's cheap to install, and that's why it's used for garages. We like the concept of having large spaces that are easy to retrofit, and we can make efficient use of the heat energy, so we don't have to do as much burning in a gen set to try to convert to electricity. But in order to do that, that remains one of our big factors with this, and this is actually one of the reasons why we don't like the gravel pit, and we certainly don't like the center of the gravel pit, because this would not be a factor for us to be able to put into play if we did that. We need to be in proximity. If we try to take that same heat value and we have a building, in this case, we have a building about 100 feet away from our site on the LWD site that uses these big unit heaters and heats huge spaces, and frankly opens the closest garage doors all winter long and wastes a lot of that heat. We can make really efficient use of that versus if I have to put it on a site where I have to pipe that heat, for the sake of discussion, several hundred feet at the closest.
Again, that's
and
a
maybe
factor, not the
hundreds
only
of feet.
factor.
So there's some factors associated with that, and again, one of the other things you mentioned is the need for regulatory approvals has been factored in here. There's a lot of other environmental factors too. We talked a little bit about the siting. I think you said you saw the map, so the memo, so I just want to make sure we're clear. The top 3 sites that did bubble up for us included the highway site, the gravel pit site, and IBM. I don't think anyone has any real questions about that, so I think
We do. Yes.
Are you still able to use, if you use the gravel pit area, are you still able to use that for heat for LELD? Is it close enough? Or is it just more expensive? Or will you not be able to do
it would be both very expensive because we'd also have to run additional piping, which are, right now our cost differential includes piping, but we don't have heat loop piping in that, so it would be additional. And there are a couple of other buildings that are closer, but still hundreds of feet away. The problem is when you try to pump, what we can do is we can run the heat actually just a liquid and literally run it in a loop. We can't do that on long distances because it becomes inefficient. It just, unfortunately, there's a certain limit of reasonable efficiency where it's not worth doing anymore. And at that point, you're better off trying to generate more electricity and less heat energy, the way we would prefer to do it. So.
Can you show where on that number 2 lot you would put the?
Do it in old fashion.
Just quickly on this.
Yeah, number, if you went to the,
Point?
yeah, I'll point. Okay, So one is,
Big yellow.
that's the LED?
Right,
Okay.
no, I'm just asking where, he said it wouldn't be right in the middle of that lot, so
Okay.
where would it be?
What were you talking, right about here?
No, come down
Here?
and towards Distribution Way.
Okay, right in
Just
here.
up a little bit from there, right around there.
All right.
Now,
Now,
the
there's
reason
probably
we-
somebody in aggregate watching this on TV and their mind's exploding. This is speculative on our part, all
Yeah, I
right?
mean, we have no rights to the property. Thanks.
And the third property again is way back up here in the common. That's-
Other side is the
Oh, it's yellow.
yellow
Yeah,
side.
right, okay, there you go, that's the sad part.
Have you commenced any conversations with the gravel pit, or have you just kind of?
Yeah, I've had a little luck getting through to them, knowing what the topic is, but we're trying other avenues.
For the 6 months of the summer, you wouldn't need, nobody would use the boiler.
So what we generally do with it is, there is still a little bit of heat use. There's a good amount of heat use that we actually use internal to the process in order to combat some of the operational issues that you've cited that happen with digesters and are very real. One thing we do is we try to run them at different temperatures that aren't natural. So instead of what they used to do with digesters, they just jack them, they'd insulate them and they try to run them. And generally they don't run well because you can't maintain heat. And so we try to run a digester, what we call is a mesophilic, or a kind of a middle temperature. If we could run it thermophilic really hot, we would do that, it would run even more efficiently, but we try to run it in this mesophilic range. In order to do that, we will actually heat jacket it and we'll exchange heat internally with the digester even in the summer.
But that
So
won't
we'll-
benefit anyone.
So we'll internally use, actually it benefits through efficiency of the digester process. And it will also use a good amount of that gas that we then won't be burning off, we'll be using it for heat.
But it could be in the gravel
process.
pit for those 6 months, and that wouldn't matter.
That still works the same way. The counter to that is in the middle of the summer when we don't have any other use for the heat. That's when we probably would generally burn it for electricity. But if you think about it, that makes the most sense with electric use too, because our peak time for electric use in systems is because people air condition in the summer. And we got to the point as a society where that's expected now. We live with a few hot days and we air condition.
Kent, at least for this session, we're running a little close on time, so I would like to cover at least some of the other properties in
Yep.
short form, so that people can at least get a sense of.
So we talked about Air Road, we talked about the gravel pit, we talked
Beyond
about
the
King
top.
Street. We talked a little bit about the analysis and what was in there. What I think, Paul, what you're talking about is just quickly hitting on the additional sites that we looked at. We do like the Middlesex Corp property, which is a little bit across the street from the current location at Highway. The challenge with that is it's not really significantly more distant from a number of homes which are across the stream. One of our biggest issues with that, again, not only is it privately owned, it's also environmentally constrained. We do like a couple of the farm properties, Site 5 and
Does anybody
Site
want
12.
some maps?
We're both agricultural land, and one of the things that was cited to us as a concern is there's a limited amount of agricultural land available in Littleton, so we're trying not to take that up if we can. If it's inactive agricultural use, we'd rather not do that. These also had other value issues, including cost.
Kent, let me interrupt there too. The one property, farm property that we did pursue a little bit more, to a little bit higher degree than others, was to actually go out and do testing, and that the consideration there was as a possibility of siting the plant while preserving the rest of the property. As it turned out, the soils weren't any good on that property for our purposes anyway, so it didn't really work out.
Site 6 on Whitcomb Ave, somebody cited to us the possibility of combining with the water treatment plant. Obviously, there's some concerns with that, and that actually is a lot closer to residential properties, so.
You got a question, ma'am?
Are you still looking at these additional sites? So
Well,
are
nothing
options?
is out until something's in, you know, that's kind of the
Because if they're
exercise.
not,
For this process to have value, you know, if you folks take a look at these lists and say, you really ought to go back and look at number 9 again, because you may not be thinking of blah, 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 or I'm aware of something you don't.
Have you ruled these additional sites out?
It's a ranking at this point, not ruled out. It's really, Ken, is that correct? It's-
We've termed them less optimal sites.
Everything can almost work here with, if cost and other things were not a factor. If, you know, if you didn't care less about using the
If we're not
heat
gonna,
and
yeah,
water.
we're not gonna, these aren't even an option, then.
Well, I'm trying hard to say that that's not the case. They are low down the list, but the ones that ended up as 2 and 3 were lower down earlier on too. Different. This hasn't remained static for the year. This has changed upon subsequent reviews.
Yeah, just to be careful with what we're doing. These are the next 9 sites that round out the top 12 best sites that we found townwide. That's why there are, as we said, there's another 60, there's actually more than 60 now, because we've added sites. A number of these sites were added after the fact at request, and they didn't meet some of those initial criteria, but we were trying to do some brainstorming with some different folks, and people threw things in. But these literally, in the process that we've come to, represent the next best sites, which is why I think it's valuable to understand some of the types of constraints with the other sites,
And the written
why
report
the ones we have.
written report does include more detail, right, on why
a
these.
bit more on each.
Okay, so if you're interested in more some of the background on why these got ranked where they did, that is available in the report that I think has been distributed electronically and is available online. Kristen?
So I'm just concerned, we have a citizen's petition about the sewage going, or whatever you want to call it, the cork, going in that spot. What value does that hold for it actually going there?
I don't know, that's more a legal question for town council. I mean, you know, the town, look at it this way, whether the petition were there or not, the town would have to affirmatively vote for this project, inclusive of this, if we're proposing it to go forward with that in there, you know what
I
I'm
mean, I
saying?
understand you guys are giving us the runaround here, and you guys are telling us you're gonna look at other spots.
Well, we're doing that right now.
And-
There's a lot of sentiment that said, look, you know, the neighbors are gonna be upset no matter what, so you
Right.
might as well just go forward with it. What we're trying to do here is,
Just tell us you're gonna look other spots.
Right.
But the money is what's,
it's a factor, not the only factor. The use of the generated energy is part of it too, because that helps, you know, that helps make the process viable, but.
so Chase, I'm curious, you have a child, would you put this in your backyard, honestly? No, you're lying, because I know you told someone you wouldn't put it.
I raised 3 kids
Okay.
with an anaerobic digester with a methane
Okay.
flare in my backyard.
Where? Well, I'm
The
just,
depot.
as a board of selectmen, I know that you're not honest right now, because I know you told people that you would not.
That is that is completely out of line.
Yeah,
Okay.
And I don't know where, I'm gonna push back on that really hard, because
You can.
when we debate the technical merits, that's fine. When you call me a liar, that's completely out of line.
Well, I know that you said 2 people
All
that
right.
you would not. put-
Whoever is characterizing that to you is not characterizing it correctly.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate if we knock it down those roads. I think we've had, I know we've got some value out of this discussion. I have anyway.
I just have one question. Sites 4 and 5, there have an extra dollar amount associated with them.
Acquisition.
No other site does. So what's the significance of those sites costing more compared to any other site?
That's a great question. The main reason that dollar value is on there, and I could probably defend this better if I had more dollars for different sites, but those were so close that we actually ran the financial analysis more specifically for those sites.
Meaning that it's the
Because
cost of the facility or the cost of acquiring the land with
it's,
the facility?
a lot of it is really about the cost of additional piping when we move things. A big thing that is hard to grasp really quickly is if we move from the gravel pit, from the highway site to the gravel pit, it looks like we're moving 1,000 feet down the road or whatever the number is. We're running 3 pipes between those 2 sites. We have to run 3 pipes from the high school to the treatment site, and those 3 pipes have a higher cost than if we were running one pipe. And that's without talking about the heat loop that we might have to run further too. So we try to attach some of the dollars to them, and that's why they only appear on a couple, because they're only on the ones that look relatively close. The challenge with most of these sites that kind of don't, and it doesn't bubble up immediately to you, is when you glance at these really quickly, there's not a lot of other municipally controlled sites. And so we don't accurately have the ability to reflect cost of land acquisition. We have budgeted a small amount of money for the functional process of land acquisition. You need attorneys, you need to go through approvals, you need to go through the physical process of appraising and come up with a value. But we can't predict what that acquisition will be, because frankly, the community doesn't use eminent domain. A lot of communities will use eminent domain, and we'll just say, we're gonna take this parcel, and we're gonna use it, and we're gonna pay fair market value back, in which case we could attach a price. We actually have to deal with the fact that the homeowner or property owner for whatever property we might use, it's private property, has to come to agreement financially with the town in order for us to use any private parcel. And that's a fairly big impediment to run numbers, so the numbers have to be kind of understood but kept soft. The main focus of the numbers that we've tried to use is more about the cost of that additional infrastructure.
And all of these
The other way, actually.
included.
Because you're using town land for a purpose that wasn't originally intended for. The town is now effectively donating land to this. And that the cost of the land that's donated should be configured into the cost as well, right? If you're going to buy,
That would be true if it was we were conflicting in a use, we would do that. If, for instance, we had a property that we were looking at, and the choice was we could either put, one of the things you're considering is a library. We could either put a library there or a wastewater facility. That would absolutely be a factor. But nobody's gonna cite something like that in the backyard.
I'm guessing
of
Kent
the
doesn't even
DPW.
know your background. I think he pulled that comparison.
Maybe a good example.
He's on the library trustee.
I don't think you wanna put the library in the back of the DPW, so, yeah.
All right, good. I'll take another question or two, but I'm conscious that the finance committee want to take over the front of the room. And I'll suggest this as some takeaways from our group, and happy to see if I've missed some things. We definitely need to go back and re-engage on options 2 and 3 to see if there's any viability there, and to flesh out what possibilities exist for us. Cost and other, cost being a factor, cost not being a factor, and new information being put into that context. Also, it becomes apparent every time we have this discussion that we need to reassure folks on, on the impact of a quirk facility on anywhere, wherever it goes. So I think we need to hear more about what concerns are and answer in a better way, what we will do proactively, and invite folks to make suggestions beyond that of ways we can protect the public from any potential risk with a quirk. And then I would say thirdly, on this list, or with other ideas, if, this has been circulated and it's available, if you've got suggestions on here or want us to re-engage thinking on any other properties, please, within the next couple of weeks, communicate with us through the various means that you can. Let us know. We're under some pressure to close the door on this process because it affects everything else. We can't settle on the finances until we get this piece fixed, and then we can't send out the letters to all the people in the district trying to get them signed up until we settle on the finances. But nonetheless, this piece is too important that even if it creates a little further delay as it is, that we've got to make sure enough people are satisfied that we've vetted it properly before we act.
One thing to add, before we take those last couple questions, so the trajectory of this is that when we come forward with design monies, right, or the totality of the package, that obviously the cost is dependent on where it's physically located, and so that's when the town as a whole, and notwithstanding the citizens petition as well, will get essentially the final definitive say on where we locate. So that's ultimately the decision now.
Wait, can you repeat that?
Town meeting will vote on it.
What was that?
Town meeting will determine.
Town meeting will ultimately vote on this when we come forward requesting the totality of I think I said design, and what I meant was construction funding. But that would be the totality of the construction funding, to the extent that we brought the construction funding forward in pieces, where perhaps the first piece was just piping in the ground, let's say. That could possibly come forward without the construction funding for the facility if we're still working.
I haven't been following, but I just need to know, is it town meeting, like this town meeting coming up? Or what town meeting? And I want to know what.
Well, votes relative to this will be on the town meeting warrant, but not likely the construction funds at this point, so.
Right, we will have on this town meeting warrant the districting of the sewer district. We'll have the home rule petition, and there is also going to be, I believe it's been certified now, a citizen's petition associated with the location of the court.
So there's no rush though to put this in. There's no rush. So if you have a full street, or a lot, I shouldn't say a full street, but a majority of a street of residents that are unhappy due to possible health reasons, you're gonna exhaust every
Well,
possible, right?
we think
before
we're
you go
doing that
forward?
right now, but
Okay.
there is a rush in the extent that we've already extended the process to allow for this process to take place, and we're willing to do it a little bit longer, but it can't go on indefinitely. At some point, we gotta, because it holds everything else up.
But I know, but I think that you really, really, really need to exhaust every possibility. You really do.
Well,
It's
to
important.
everybody's satisfaction, I'm not sure that's possible,
Well,
but
when it
we're
comes-
trying to do that.
I know, but when it comes to the health of,
Yep.
health and well-being, it's very important, and I hope that everybody in this room understands that.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, a couple more right in this corner right here.
There is potential to use the heat at some commercial buildings at the gravel pit, right? That's what, in the write-up, it said there were some potential commercial buildings that could use
The
it.
closest buildings we can find are the other ones on Distribution Way, those big warehouses there, and again, that's a little bit of a, that's an assumption as
More-
we
more
locate
analysis
near
has to be
there,
done on that.
That we can get to them, that they would be
Yeah, but
cooperative because they're private
If
properties.
we're able to get more serious in that property, we'll obviously dig down and do more analysis on that parcel.
I'm just curious, when it's presented at town meeting, is it basically just a funds presentation, or are you able to present multiple options for which can be voted?
Everything we've talked about when it comes out for the final vote is just one big vote, which we're trying to deal with the individual controversial pieces in this context so that we can get them all wrapped up in advance.
So when you say it's too late for the meetings, that means probably pushed off till November?
I hate to say that, but I mean, that part of it, yeah, but that doesn't mean we're still under the gun to get a lot of work done.
Right, yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay. Jim?
I know that there are a lot of business owners and residential people who have either failing or failed septics, who have been frustrated waiting for this, and it's been how long? 12 years?
Well,
We'll be talking about it.
27 by some people's calendars, but that's...
Yeah, so, I mean, there's some pressure to do something, and where it's gonna happen,
It's been
hopefully
27
that works
years?
out.
And there's pressure now?
Yeah,
Oh.
that's when I started on it.
Well, your septic, it's failing, and yeah, there'll be some pressure.
My septic was failing, I just have to replace it because this isn't available to me, so I feel like that's, I mean.
Well,
It's hard to say when it's gonna go.
I actually
Hey.
support this, my only problem is
Hopefully this
location.
process will yield the next one being so much easier, because the different parts of town can certainly use it. Okay, thank you all, we will be, if you want to hang around and have direct questions with someone, we have to give up the room, but we'll be hanging around
It'd be
here.
nice to know when the date would you be able to decide, it's like, a
Uh,
lot of things we're trying to decide, like, are we gonna move or what, so.
One side of the room is push it off as quick as you want, the other side of the room is hurry up and make up your mind, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm just curious when we'll have an idea of that's all.
Well, there'll be some, votes on some topics this spring and hopefully construction in the fall special town meeting.
So basically November, we won't know what the site, we'll be, so like.
You'll know what we're likely to propose on the site before that. Well before that. We need that to act on next week.